Okay,
All right,
no
thanks.
problem.
All right.
And I wanted to say thanks for having me again this year, and it's always my pleasure to participate in the summit, and I consider many of you friends now after 7 years or so of this, and I'm happy to be able to come and speak about something more than carbon policy or the latest legislation. Um, so I'll be talking about a project that we've been working on with the Conservation District, and it's a joint project between my organization, National Fisheries Conservation Center, and its Global Ocean Health Program, and the coastal engineering firm, Stantec. So I'm just going to do kind of an overview of the issue and the history of it, and then Aaron will talk about what we've been doing this year actively. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And let's see. All right. So in the beginning, around the early 90s, in 1990-91, the Corps of Engineering did a deep dredge project, and shortly after, Grays Harbor oyster growers started noticing major impacts from sediment smothering their oysters up to a foot at a time, where they were experiencing major losses, collective millions of dollars of lost crops over time. DNR reports a lot of lost lease income, and both growers and DNR reported just sheer acreage lost due to the sediment. And nobody thought that the deep dredge occurring around the same time as the problem was a coincidence. And in particular, Whitcomb Flats, which is a natural area preserve, which is a designation that Washington State makes for some of the rarest animal and bird habitat, the rarest prime examples of ecological habitat, um, is Whitcomb Flat. Whitcomb Flat is as a natural area preserve, and there's only 57 sites in the state, although Grays Harbor actually has the most of any county in Washington state with 6 sites. But it was prime Caspian tern breeding ground, but it was migrating really quickly. It was also considered some of the best oyster growing lands, and it was just moving really rapidly. And at tide, the entire thing was being covered so that the terns no longer nested there. And so there was some video being taken and just a lot of discussion about the problem that people were experiencing here. So in 2003, the Port of Grays Harbor ordered a report done by Pacific International Engineering to look at the history of dredging and morphological changes in Grays Harbor from the very earliest maps to the current time. And that was in response to these growing concerns. And Whitcomb Flats was considered to represent some of the most dramatic changes that were occurring in the harbor. And this is a piece from that report that shows how Whitcomb Flats had changed and migrated over time from 1967 to 2001. And from the report, it indicated an average net rate of migration of 30 to 32 meters per year over the course of that 35 years. So, I mean, that is just an insane amount for what's essentially an island to be migrating. And oyster growers were reporting that they would plant a crop on a certain part of the island, market, know where they thought they planted it, and then return and not even be able to locate the site anymore because the shape of it and the location of it had changed so dramatically over the course of a single season. So originally the Corps did admit fault. This letter from 2003 to DNR was a result of the report from Pacific International Engineering, and it said that they found the hypothesis plausible that storm waves from the ocean and associated high water levels resulted in overtopping of the sand flat, and that it was supported by other studies conducted since '74, and that all the studies indicated that significant geomorphic changes in Grays Harbor were attributable to the construction of the Grays Harbor Navigation Project. So at one point, they were willing to admit that that they were responsible. And negotiations between DNR and the Corps had really moved along, where the Corps was going to fund significant mitigation measures. They had actually gotten down to the nitty-gritty of discussing specific measures like loose or bagged oyster shell, pilings, geotubes, which are kind of these enormous sand tubes that can be used to block wave energy, but still allow plants and other ecological action to happen. And then reef balls, which are designed specifically to break up wave energy and also provide really prime habitat for juvenile species of crabs, oysters, and fish. But in 2006, it all kind of fell apart. I think there was a leadership change at the Corps, and discussions just really ended. And since that date, they have stopped admitting any responsibility, and they now fully deny that that their navigation project or that their ongoing dredging has anything to do with the sedimentation problems. So they are no longer a source of funding and are not even very helpful in providing their own studies and data regarding the issue. So in 2015, Global Ocean Health was hired by the Conservation District to do a phase 1 study looking at these issues, and we interviewed most of the growers and took direct testimony about the impacts that they had experienced. We did a literature review, including that really significant report from 2003, investigated various mitigation options, and corresponded with the agencies that had been involved, including some of the DNR employees that had been actively part of discussions with the Corps earlier in the decade. So we wrote a paper with a lengthy appendix, including some of those original documents and some video from earlier in the project. Shortly after the deep dredge project had happened, that discussed the issues and particularly what was happening in Whitcomb Flats. And the main result was recommending that the next step would be hydrodynamic modeling, and that is not an inexpensive prospect. So it took some time and a lot of work, but I was really pleased to last year have the opportunity to bid on phase 2. But meanwhile, some quotes from that report from 2015 from some of the local growers. They said that that year in 2015, they'd lost 2 beds, that they'd set the seed in 2011, spread the oysters in 2012, and had expected to harvest that year. The total income that was lost from sedimentation was about $210,000, that they were nearly full grown oysters. They went to check on them after some high swells, and they'd been buried to the lips in sand. And despite their efforts to try to harrow and rescue the oysters, they lost both beds. Another prominent grower in Grosskalber lost 46 acres in Central Bay due to sand movement that he estimates cost the company $440,000 annually. Stated that there was approximately 150 acres around Whitcomb Flats that were threatened by sediment transport, and that without mitigation, the issues would cost the company up to $1 million annually, and that there was a lot more sediment coming into North Bay as well, that they had deep sea beds with a shelly bottom that now in the past 10 to 15 years had been covered in sediment, and that they were nearly ready to abandon that ground. He said that was likely the last year that they would risk using it, and that they were only transporting large oysters there for their final season because young oysters would be smothered by the sand. So this is something that was really still a very active problem for growers. And so they spoke up and continued to make some noise. And thanks to the county commissioner and Senator Walsh in particular, the Conservation District was allocated the funding to do this phase 2 hydro and morphological modeling of not only Grays Harbor, but Willapa Bay as well. So beginning in 2002, we've been working with Stantec to do this modeling using data from the Corps, USGS, satellite data, academic papers, direct input from growers, and additional sources that we found that have provided input for this very sophisticated model that reveal the fate of the dredged material and the flow of sediment within both harbors. So by year's end, we'll be identifying the best possible mitigation from the farm scale all the way up to the estuary scale, and making our recommendations not only based on this data, but also factoring biological aspects in. So things like burrowing shrimp and eelgrass and subsidence that can happen in some areas, and consider all of those factors in trying to decide what solutions could best work to prevent this smothering of oysters and the loss of some of the country's best oyster lands. So Erin, our next presenter, will share some of the results from the modeling that we've done so far throughout the year, starting in January. But that's an overview of the history of the project, and any questions that you have about that, I would be happy to hear. And you can reach out to me anytime to learn more about the project and just share any thoughts that you have regarding the greater picture. So thank you.